forbidden and banned, the bane of bureaucrats, exposing mainstream media's weapons of mass distraction.
Flying under the radar and dropping truth bombs on tyranny.
It's Liberty Now. Kia ora, hello, and welcome to Liberty Now, the show for discerning minds and common sense. We seek the truth and can think for ourselves. I'm your host, John Vert. Thank you for stopping by. I'll be here with you every week, looking beyond the headlines, asking questions, and talking to people who are making a difference. Today, I'm privileged to be speaking with renowned author Patrick Wood. He is a leading and critical expert on sustainable development, green economy, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and historic technocracy. And he is the author of one of the best books I've ever read on connecting the dots between these topics. Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. Patrick, hello.
Hello. Good to be with you.
Yeah.
This message is going all over the world, and this is a good thing because it is a global problem and it can only be solved on a global basis, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I can appreciate that more and more. How are you doing?
We're in the Phoenix area, and it's very
okay.
hot right now. We're not as hot as Death Valley is in California, but it's been warm summer and lots of stuff going on. On the other hand, activity, freedom-wise, we're hopping like we've never been hopping before.
Yeah.
Got our fingers in a lot of things, and we're kind of hanging by a thread right now. I'll be honest with you, like you guys are. I know it's like stuff is happening in your country and in Australia. I never ever thought would happen.
Yeah,
amazing.
The same.
How fast too.
Yeah, it really has accelerated. I've had a sense that this kind of thing, we'll call it creeping tyranny, has been going on for a while. But I never expected it to get to this point or this quickly. But it's a reality, and it's one I'm doing everything I can to avoid the consequences of it as best we can. I understand you just completed an intensive book tour. How did that go?
Well, it's going good still. I do a lot of writing and I do a lot of radio interviews and stuff like that. It's not about books necessarily, even though I have books and I do like to sell them. Obviously, I can't give them away. If I could give them away, if I was a billionaire, I'd print up enough and give them to everyone in the country.
Well, yeah,
I'd do it right away. But it's a necessity that we have to sell books, and it's just a lot of people today just don't want to read. They just flat out will not read. And videos, they'll look little short bumper sticker articles, but
right. That's funny. That I think that was one of my big motivations to start doing a podcast, because I love to read. I grew up, my father was a librarian. I grew up in the library, and I've always loved to read. I've been, insatiably curious. And I know not everybody, has that background, but I'm really amazed how many people just refuse to read. I'm like, I show them that this is proof of what we've been talking about. You really need to know this stuff. Read this book, please. And it's hard. It's like pulling teeth. And so maybe by putting out videos, people will pay a little more attention. But in your book, you get to a lot of things that have been nagging at me for a good number of years. And how long have you had the sense that we're not in Kansas anymore?
Probably the day I started writing about globalization back in the late 1970s. That's really when it hit me that there's a rough road ahead.
Yeah.
And modern globalization that we have today was actually born in the early 1970s. There were lots of people who believed in it before that, but nothing had ever really clicked with them, the global elite, that is. And
right.
met with obstacles. They got rejected multiple times in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it wasn't until the early 1970s when money man David Rockefeller got into it with his co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and they really defined modern globalization. And their idea at the time was to create a new international economic order. Their words, not mine.
Right. AKA the New World Order.
but we knew it was serious, and we figured, okay, these guys are up to something, and but that's where it started. And their plan has been very quiet up until just recently. In fact, they would say people like myself and my former co-author Anthony Sutton were just wingnuts, we're the
Right.
conspiracy theorists, and we
Like
don't know
Birchers.
anything. But now they're out in the open. Like the World Economic Forum, for instance, is populated by the same people, same kind of people that used to be in the Trilateral Commission in the early days. The multinational corporations, directors and chairmen of the board, and leaders of countries and stuff are belonging to this group now.
Right.
The World Economic Forum, and they're wide open. They're saying everything in the open now. There's no hiding it whatsoever. They say you'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
Right. I
Real.
know. And it amazes me. Like they're so conceited. There's so much hubris. Like they don't think, I mean, I guess maybe enough people aren't reading their papers. But I certainly have been. And you speak of globalism. I know it's linked to the term technocracy, but let's start with the term technocracy itself. For those not familiar with the term, how do you define it?
Well, it's I always defer back to how they defined it in the early 1930s. So that what I say about it is not as important as what they said about themselves.
Sure.
They call it the science of social engineering, number one. Number two, they called it a replacement economic system for capitalism and free enterprise. In other words, free market economics. There had never been in the history of the world, even now, another alternative economic system that anybody developed from scratch. These people did. They were at Columbia University in New York City at the time, which was the leading center of progressive thought.
Yes.
And they were scientists and engineers that got together with some people outside, but mostly from there, to kind of crystallize this new economic system in engineering and scientific terms. And they felt that capitalism was dead anyway, so why not do it? That was during the Great Depression, 1932.
Right.
So they did, and they called it technocracy. It was a resource-based economic system, much like sustainable development is today. I believe they're essentially equivalent, functionally equivalent at least. And it fell out of favor. It had no support back in those early days in the 30s and 40s. There was no institutional money that they had. There were no Rockefellers or Carnegies or MacArthur's or anybody else that gave them any big funding.
Right. The economy was booming at that time, right? Post World War II. So there's probably no incentive to look at an alternative.
Yep. Things changed. Capitalism came back. Didn't die. And the whole concept pretty much lay dormant until 1973, when it was resuscitated by the Trilateral Commission, but they did not call it technocracy.
Right. And the Trilateral Commission members or partners are primarily the United States, Japan, and England, or
Europe in general.
Europe, just Europe in general. Okay. And this was pre-EU.
Yes.
But that was foreseen long before it occurred. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was that not part of Hitler's future vision to create a single unified Europe?
Well, I think there was a lot of interplay there with it. I think some of the ideologues and stuff had been exposed to what happened in Nazi Germany and World War II. Was it explicitly? Maybe not. But I know there's a thread of history that runs through it. The EU, however, the creation of the EU can be traced directly to members of the Trilateral Commission.
Yeah. And it was created and instituted without a vote.
That's right.
And yet you see
trade agreement, I might add. It started out as just a simple trade agreement.
Right.
From there.
Right. Kind of like NAFTA. Since the globalization of information, the internet age that we're in now, we've been hearing terms like New World Order, even before that, and now the singularity and more recently, the Great Reset. Do you see these as distinct separate events or somehow related to the same thing?
They're all related.
As a singular event. And this is global in nature. And could you say in a nutshell what you see on what that means for general humanity?
Yeah, and I would point out that the concept of singularity, which was created by the head of engineering at Google, Ray Kurzweil,
Right.
That was his baby. What he's predicting is that there will be a time in the future when AI outruns or exceeds the intelligence of man and will begin to recreate itself and go vertical and possibly dominate all of humanity in the world after that.
Right. Terminator.
Yeah, Terminator style.
Right.
That's very speculative, and the odds of it happening probably pretty slim. But Kurzweil is definitely part of the transhuman movement in the world that predicts that man will be able to escape death ultimately, and to apply high technology to the human condition. In other words, hack the body and become post-human. Ultimately, that's what they're looking for, is to be post-human, where your soul and brain can be downloaded into a computer and re-uploaded into some other entity, whether it be a spaceship or an android or somebody else's body, for that matter. Very science fiction.
And it's interesting, like throughout the entire concept, the whole ideology of all this it sounds very much like a religion, another one that far precedes it. I don't know if people who are acolytes of this are, really realize that it is just as much a religion. We're going to overcome death, but it's sort of a counterfeit.
The way they're running science right now, it's like, get away from my body.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Don't touch me.
Yeah. In fact, it gets into some speculation. I mean, I don't have proof other than what I've heard from, scientists or other doctors about some of the things that are in these injections that we're seeing. Graphene oxide being one of those things. I don't know that that's been proven yet or not, but I have seen research papers and patents for its use in tracking and tracing. Looking at the bigger picture, I guess it wouldn't surprise me if those kinds of little extra things are in these vaccines. But again, I just want to talk about the stuff that I can prove, and
Exactly.
demonstrate. But
well, if you look at the World Economic Forum today, you'll find two things on their website. One has to do with the Great Reset, which mostly concerns economic issues. They're looking to build back on the scorched earth policy of destroying capitalism, free enterprise, to build this new technocratic system on top of it. But there's another thread to the Great Reset that most people, commentators, don't talk about, and that is the threat of transhumanism.
Right.
Klaus Schwab and most of his high officials at the World Economic Forum are totally bought into the concept of transhumanism, where technology is going to be able to change the human condition, in particular genetic technology. They're very much in tune with the modern transhuman movement there. There are many articles on their website, in the blog area, for instance, that deal specifically with transhumanism and how this technology is going to reset the human condition as well as society. So it led me to make the statement, because technocracy and transhumanism really are two different topics. They should be treated differently. But technocracy is to society and the structure of society, as transhumanism is to the people who are going to live in that society. So they're going to recreate a new society, a new economic system, new type of structure of society, but they also want to change the nature of humanity that's going to live in that new society. So when Klaus Schwab talks about the Great Reset, you need to kind of consider these two concepts together, because it's a total reset. They're going to reset you and me, and they're going to reset the world system at the same time.
Right. Physically, genetically, and economically. And that answers one of my questions. I was wondering, when you talk about the topic of technocracy, do you see it primarily as an economic system? That's only part of the picture.
It is.
That's the social engineering part, I guess.
Right. Scientism is like a Siamese twin to technocracy.
Right. Okay.
They're joined at the hip.
That's a good way to put it.
Very much so.
And when we're talking about the topic of economics, do you have an opinion about Austrian versus Keynesian economic schools? And anybody that isn't familiar with those terms, I recommend that you go look them up and see what the differences are. But do you have an opinion?
Well, I studied Keynesian economics in college under my economics degree, and it was useless. Totally, none of it worked.
Okay.
After I got out of college, I discovered the Austrian School of Economics and studied it just as probably with more intent than Keynesian theory.
Right.
And it answered a lot more questions than anything else that I'd ever studied in college. There's a problem, however, with all the tools of Austrian economics, and there are many that are quite different than Keynesians, studying Keynesian economics.
Okay.
The problem right now with Austrian economic theory is not that it can't answer questions about our current economic system, right? Like what's going on today with our price-based, currency-based supply and demand system.
Right.
But it has none of those tools have any ability to look at technocracy and try and make sense out of it.
Right.
And because of that, there's been no serious economist in the world. I'll say there's a couple of exceptions now, just recently, but there have not been any certified, if you will, I don't know, educated economists like professors at university who have been able to look at technocracy and make any sense, even though it's a replacement economic system, even though sustainable development is the biggest thing that's ever hit the world.
Right.
They can't make sense of it. They can't make any predictions, any forecasts. They can't say, well, okay, will it work or not, sort of thing.
Right.
Because tools were not built to understand anything about a resource-based economic system. They just simply don't work. So it's kind of like, let's say that you were, say you had a PhD in entomology, which is the study of bugs. Okay.
Yeah.
Very bright guy. You went to school, you did a lot of study, you wrote a thesis about bugs, maybe grasshoppers, whatever. And then somebody grabs you at the university and says, could you write a paper on the physical aspects of black holes?
Right. Right.
Oh.
Right.
Well, now I know the different kinds of bugs and I know how they multiply and yada, yada.
Right.
But none of what they ever learned to analyze insects would work at analyzing black holes.
Right. Well, if the Austrian school were a living organism, it doesn't have antibodies for something that it's never been exposed to, I suppose.
I hope. But so far I've probably in the last, 10 years, I've asked dozens of economists to give me a read on technocracy and on sustainable development. They can't do it.
Right.
I know it's not right. I'm not saying they say, oh, that's a great thing. They're not. They say, well, it sounds really crackpot to me. It sounds just like another utopian dream that can't possibly ever work, but that's about as far as it goes.
Right. Right. And I feel like we're, the rebellion again among a lot of younger people, especially there's a sort of rebellion against capitalism. But they're blaming capitalism for the problems of Keynesian economics, I think, or communism. I see the tie to that sort of centralized control. I've never seen it work in any of my reading or history of the world, where that works for the benefit of the people.
And sustainable development will not work either. The whole point originally of sustainable development was to grab resources, in my opinion.
Right.
It was a resource grab in the history of the planet. They want to take all the resources away from the people and the nation state, put them into a global common trust and run them for the benefit of man, where they control everything.
Right.
That doesn't need economic analysis, by the way. That's just, they own everything and you own nothing. Okay,
exactly.
Economics.
Exactly. And this is not just a hypothetical. I see this as a real existential threat. And these talks, the discussion of, Agenda 21 and, sustainable development, I don't think people have connected the dots, but you look at incidents like what happened at the Bundy Ranch in America, right? Where there was this giant land grab, ostensibly because they were concerned about the desert tortoise, right? Which turned out to be completely false. So they're kicking ranchers off of their property. I just sort of see this as a microcosm of, what's coming and what has been going on. Did you follow that event at all?
I did quite. It was in my home state. It was right here.
Oh, right.
The Bundys lived right on the border of Arizona and Nevada, and their case was important, certainly because it showed how the government was trying to appropriate land from private property owners. But
right.
in America, over 30% of the landmass of America is now directly owned and controlled by the United States government, which is not in our Constitution, obviously, but it's. People ask, well, why would they own all that real estate? Well, yeah, why? They're taking it out of production. You can't go on it. You can't mine it, drill it, timber it, or whatever, unless you have special permits from the people that are controlling it. Right. Same thing is true with all the oil and gas fields in the Gulf of Mexico and around the coastal areas of the United States. You have the United Nations going all over the world, setting aside heritage zones where vast swaths of land, productive land, full of minerals and timber and all kinds of cool stuff, are declared to be off limits and managed by the United Nations. And there's incentives they give to countries to participate in that, all monetary, I might add.
Right.
But the United Nations has gone around the whole planet, and I don't know the total number of acres now, the square miles they have under their control. But every time they set aside a heritage zone, development stops on that real estate. Typically, completely stops.
Right.
You say, well, but we want to have national, biodiversity, and we want to have, species preservation and that sort of stuff. That's just nonsense argument for this. It's a resource grab that denies productive citizens and running productive companies to make productive use out of those resources.
Right.
Let me emphasize this point because this is important. I don't know if you ever listened to any James Bond movies.
Right.
The first movie made by Sean Connery, who starred as James Bond, 007, was called Goldfinger.
Mm-hmm.
Goldfinger had a very interesting plot. There was this big, heavy guy named Goldfinger who loved gold. And so he was buying up gold in the open market. He had gold this and gold that, gold car, and, he loved gold.
Right.
And he had a plan to conquer the world. So what he did, as the plot kind of thickened, he was going to attack Fort Knox in America.
Right.
And the implication was he was going to steal all the gold out of Fort Knox. Well, there's a lot of gold there, let me tell you.
Yeah.
And you were led to believe that he was going to steal the gold. But as the plot kind of got mentioned, to the end of it, he actually had a small nuclear device that he was going to smuggle into Fort Knox, or not smuggle, but break in and take this nuclear device then and blow it up right in the middle of Fort Knox gold. And you see, the effect of this would be irradiating all of the gold would make it off limits. Ain't nobody going near that gold anymore because you'd fry and, you got 20 feet from it.
Right.
So his plan was to take all that gold offline to where nobody could touch it, use it, transact with it, nothing. You couldn't put it on a ship and send it to Europe. It was just dead gold. It was like making it vaporize and go away.
Useless.
That was an ingenious plan because what he was figuring was when he irradiated the gold in Fort Knox, the value of his gold would go through the roof, right?
Right.
This is what happens when you take economic resources away from productivity.
Right.
The remaining resources get more scarce and hence get more expensive, right?
Right.
It's inevitable.
Precisely.
Supply and demand. You take all of the good resources of the world, take them out of production, and what's left all of a sudden becomes super valuable. And we can see this crazy resource grab going on all over the world, and it has been for some time. The rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, property rights will degrade everywhere, even as they are in America.
Right.
And the average person will end up with no anything in the end. And that's why Klaus Schwab, curse his name, can stand up and say, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And all I can say is quit gaslighting us, for crying out loud.
Right.
You'll own nothing and who's going to be happy if they don't own anything? That's
right.
so stupid.
Why
would anybody accept such a statement? I don't get it.
It's fundamental.
I asked the question, who is going to own all the stuff that you rent?
Right. Right. If we're not going to, who is? And how do you justify that?
Well, yeah. And so they're going to own the stuff and they're going to rent it to you when you need it. You don't have to own anything. You'll be so happy that you have to rent it, don't have to maintain it. This is just patently ridiculous. And again, there's no economic theory here that can explain this in the history of the world. It's just flat out direct dictatorship of resources.
Right. And self-government and self-ownership and the right to own personal property or things is fundamental. It's at the core of our Constitution and of all economic and social systems that function well. Without that ability, there's no incentive for creativity, for production, for all the things that we've seen, all the technology that we enjoy today benefits from that core fundamental principle. And yet they're using all these same technologies to now remove that incentive. They're basically killing the goose that laid the golden egg.
That's right. They've kidnapped the goose.
Right. They've kidnapped the goose. Yeah. And one of the methodologies by which this is being accomplished, you touched on this earlier about wanting to devastate the current economic system with some utopian replacement. But you're probably familiar with the Cloward and Piven plan. Do you see that as just an academic exercise for a couple of professors, or do you see it as an action plan?
At this point, I don't see it as an action plan because of them.
Okay.
But all this stuff had to come from someone, and it was all progressive. Originally, it was all progressive thought that came out of the 20s and the teens and the 20s and the 30s. But it took a turn when technocracy came along. It really did take a turn. For instance, the technocrats and communists hated each other in the 1930s. There was no love lost between them. They hated each other.
Right.
And the technocrats wouldn't have anything to do with them, flat out. And the reason was because communism still hung on to a price-based economic system.
Right.
Currency, money, supply and demand on money. And the technocrats said, that's all wrong. All wrong. We have to count for everything by energy. How much energy went in, how much energy comes out, that sort of thing.
Right.
And they still believe the same thing. I think there's an antipathy between sustainable development and communism today, even though there are some overlaps, granted.
Okay.
But at the core of it, the people at the top have an otherworldly view of it, and they have no use for politicians whatsoever.
Right. That was one of the primary, I guess, motivations or original thoughts coming out of technocracy, is that they felt that politicians weren't capable of leading or governing, and it needed to be scientists who run the world.
That's right. They wanted to get rid of all political structures in America and have like an organization chart that you see in a corporation, for instance, for America, where there'd be the head technocrat, and then there'd be a bunch of other departments underneath him, all run by appointed engineers, scientists, and technicians. No political structure, no parliament, no Congress, not even any city councils or state governments. Not necessary. Science could run it right from the top. That's what they believe.
Well, that's all we've got time for in this episode. Thank you for listening. And if you're enjoying this conversation with author Patrick Wood, please stay tuned. We'll pick up the conversation and continue in the next episode. Meanwhile, make sure you go to libertynow.com. Check out the show notes. I've dropped some links in there for you regarding the Cloward and Piven plan and some background on Keynesian economics, Klaus Schwab, and more. So make sure you go check that out. Until next time, be good and keep asking questions.